Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this special presentation we've brought to you today. We're going to be covering some of the new Senate bill that passed, kind of referred to as Senate Bill 4-D. This bill was passed recently and will likely have significant impacts on many condo associations as well as different co-ops. So before we get started, I always like to go through some little housekeeping things. If you have any questions, you can type them in either in the chat or in the questions box on your screen. And we'll make sure that we'll get those addressed. We'll try to filter them in as many as we can during the presentation. The rest that will get addressed afterwards. Normally we end somewhere right around 11 with slightly going longer just to address some of the questions that different people present to us. Also, we wanted to let you know that if you would like a copy, or everyone will be getting a copy of today's presentation, we will be releasing that after the presentation for all of the different attendees. So those of you who are not too familiar with me and who I am, my name is Rain McCready. I'm one of the directors at Stromer & Company, which is a full-service CPA firm. We assist many associations throughout the state of Florida with tax returns, audits, reviews, compilations, and all of that wonderful fun number stuff. I also have the pleasure of having John Stromer here with us for today's presentation. John, do you want to take a few moments and maybe introduce yourself and say a few words?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. It's great to have everybody on this presentation here. Like Rain says, we're a pretty large CPA firm. We do this work throughout the state of Florida. Been doing it about 30 years. I'm the founding partner, managing partner of the firm, and I'm just blessed to be surrounded by some great professionals like Rain. And also Richard. Richard's an awesome dude.
All right. So now I'm going to have the opportunity to turn this over to Richard, who's the man of the hour, who's going to give us all this wonderful information about this legislative update. Richard, turning it over to you.
Thank you. It looks like we have a record turnout for our MAID seminar. We're over 200. That's everybody is interested in this. Let me give you a little background of how we got to where we are, and then I'm going to go through the bullet points of the bill, and then John will jump in and we'll kind of do a back and forth on questions. Let me say this. This is a brand new bill. It became law May 26th. We've all digested it in about 2 weeks. We're not, and I don't think anybody can give you absolute specific answers to all the good questions we're going to get, because we just don't know. And like with any legislation that was kind of rushed through, as John's going to point out to you, there are already glitches and things that don't quite make sense and questions that are not answered in the bill. So we're going to do the best we can with the information that we have. But I think as we get more familiar with this bill, we'll find out a lot more and be able to answer a lot more questions. This bill obviously came about as a result of the Surfside Champlain Towers building collapse tragedy that occurred about a year ago today, I think, around June of 2021. As a result of that, obviously, there was a study commission put together by the Florida Bar to make recommendations of changes in the condominium law and co-op law and high-rise law to make sure this would not happen again. And that went through a process, and in the legislative session that started in March of this year and ended in May, there were several bills going back and forth, and the House and the Senate could not exactly agree. And when the regular session ended, they had no new laws. There was nothing. It failed at the last minute, and we thought, oh, wow, we're kind of done. We're going to have to wait till next year. But the legislature has the ability to call a special session, and so they called a special session in May to address insurance issues. But there was such a hue and cry from the general public saying, you guys didn't do anything about the Surfside problem. You've got to do something, you really dropped the ball here. So they kind of set aside their differences and they put together SB4-D, which is Senate Bill 4-D. D is the special session that it was in. And it kind of, they pushed it through and it got done very, very quickly. And there's good parts and there's some bad parts and there's other parts that we don't really understand. So I'm going to start walking us through it, and then we'll answer questions as
Rich,
they come up.
to add something to that, as we
Sure.
discussed yesterday, because of so much uncertainty, there's things that need to be clarified. We're expecting glitch bills to come out this upcoming year, maybe the year after, because it's going to end up somewhere different than where it is now. but not the substance of it, probably some form and phase-ins and who knows what. But there's going to be a lot of questions. We're going to try to answer most of them, but some of them are going to be like Richard says, we just don't know. The legislator don't know, the politicians don't know. So we'll work through it. I think this is a good start to the educational process. So Rich, go ahead.
Okay. I also want to give credit to Chris Miller of my firm, who put together this slideshow. It's a lot easier to follow than just the dry outline that I drafted. So thanks to Chris. Don't need to see that. So Senate Bill 4-D. There's actually two major components to this Senate bill. There's part one is called a milestone inspection section, which we're going to cover first. And then part two is a reserve section, new requirements for what they call structural integrity reserve studies. So we're going to start with the milestone inspections. But who does the laws that we're talking about today, who do they affect? Okay, they do not affect all condos and co-ops. First of all, they affect no homeowners associations. So if you're a Chapter 720 homeowner association, this bill and what we're going to talk about, except near the very end, there's a small section that would pertain to you. This does not affect Chapter 720 homeowners association. It only affects Chapter 718 condos and Chapter 719 cooperatives. Okay. And then within those two types of community associations, it only affects buildings that are 3 stories or more in height. So if you have a 2-story co-op or a 1-story co-op or a 2-story condo or a 1-story condo, for the most part, and I'll explain that a little bit later, none of this applies to you. It applies to 3 stories or more. Now, the number one question that I've been getting immediately is, well, what if we have 3 stories, but the first story is a parking garage and there are 2 occupiable floors above that? Okay. This bill makes no distinction about occupiable, unoccupiable, makes no distinction. So for now, the law is, yes, it would apply if you had 2 occupiable stories on 2 and 3 and a ground floor parking garage or commercial space or whatever it might be. So for now, the answer to that question is yes, this is going to apply to you from what we know today. But back to the milestone inspections. There's two requirements for the milestone inspection. And that basically is an inspection that will be done in 2 phases to determine whether there are any structural integrity problems with the buildings. The first one has, if you are more than 3 miles away from the coastline of Florida, you have to do a milestone inspection 30 years from the date of the certificate of occupancy that was issued for your building. Your lawyer or an engineer can tell you when the CO date is, but the CO date is really when you're allowed to move in and occupy the building. So if you're not 30 years from that yet, your birthday hasn't come up for your 30-year birthday, you've got a little bit of time. If you were in a condo or a co-op, I think January 1, 1992, anybody before that date, you are already at the 30-year mark, okay? So you're going to, but they've given you a reprieve in the sense that they've said, even though you're past the 30 years, we know you're going to need a little bit of time to do the milestone inspection. So the first, anybody that's currently 30 years or older, your milestone inspection, which we'll get into more in a minute, is going to be due no later than December 31, 2024. Okay, so about 2.5 years from now, based on the current bill, the current law, you're going to have to do it. Now, if you're within 3 miles or closer to the coastline, you have to do a milestone inspection when your building becomes 25 years old. Again, if you're already past the 25-year deadline, your first milestone inspection will be required on December 31, 2024. Okay, then after you do the milestone inspection, for the first time, every 10 years thereafter, you have to do it again. So if you do your first one on January or December 31, 2024, the next one will be done, have to be done in 2034, 2044, and so on. Let me explain. I've got the statute right here. What is a milestone inspection? Okay, what does that entail? I'm just going to read to you. And again, you're going to have to hire an engineer or a licensed Florida architect to do this, but it says a milestone inspection means a structural inspection of a building, including an inspection of load-bearing walls and the primary structural members and primary structural systems, as those terms are defined in the law, conducted by a licensed architect or engineer authorized to practice in the state of Florida for the purposes of attesting to the life safety and adequacy of the structural components of the building. Okay, so that's basically what's going to have to be done, and it has to be done by not just any engineer. There are certain kinds of engineers, and it's a structural engineer that has to do it. So that's the dates you're going to have to deal with. So I just read this about what is a milestone inspection. Now there's two parts to the milestone inspection. This is the part, and this is the first time we've done this outline, so it's a little if it's a little rusty here, I apologize for that. But like I said, if your building is older than July 1, 1992, your first due date is December 31, 2024. Thereafter, it's 30 years or 25 years from the date of issuance of the CO. Okay. Let's see. Will the milestone inspection be notified? Will the association be notified it needs to have it done? Yes. The local building enforcement agencies must provide written notice that an inspection is required by certified mail return receipt requested. I wouldn't wait for the notice. You should figure these dates out now, and we'll get into that more. Within 188 days after receiving the notice, the association must complete phase 1 of the milestone inspection. We're going to talk about what those phases are. So there's two types of two parts to the milestone inspection. The first one is called a phase 1. In the phase 1, the architect or engineer performs a visual examination of the habitable and non-habitable areas of the building, including major structural components. The inspector must then prepare a qualitative assessment of the structural conditions of the building. If there are no signs of substantial structural deterioration of the building components, a phase 2 is not required. So that's basically going to be an engineer and architect walking around your building, making visual observations and notes, and probably videoing it. They won't be, breaking walls or going into digging in the ground or anything like that. If the visual inspection, based on their professional opinion, doesn't reveal any structural problems, you're done. That's your milestone inspection. You're good to go until 10 years later when you have to do it again. Now, if the and this just talks about what is considered substantial structural deterioration, means structural distress that negatively affects the building's general conditions. The term does not include surface imperfections such as cracks, distortion, sagging, deflections, misalignment. So, when you see just general conditional things, that's not necessarily going to put you into a phase 2. But if based on this, they see things that they believe are structural integrity problems, you will then have to go to a phase 2 inspection. So what happens if the building fails the phase 1 milestone inspection? Then phase 2 of the milestone inspection must be completed. Phase 2 is at the discretion of the inspector that performed the inspection. So it's not going to be up to your board to say, well, we don't want to do phase 2. If the engineer or architect says phase 2 is warranted, you have to do phase 2. Okay. You're not going to have any option not to do it. Phase 2 may involve destructive or non-destructive testing at the inspector's discretion. What if phase 2 of the milestone inspection, inspections at the direction of the inspector that may be extensive or limited as necessary to fully assess areas of structural distress in order to confirm the building is structurally sound. It also serves to function as determining how to access and repair. So they're going to tell you what you need to do. And preference must be given to testing locations that are the least disruptive and most easily repairable while being representative of the structure. So that means they're not going to go into every single unit and rip it apart. They're going to take some samples and do some inspections of there, but they will be more invasive than a phase 1. Okay.
Hey, Rich.
Yep.
Interesting. So a couple things. So the cost of reserve studies are going to go up. I would hate to be an engineer because you think about the extra responsibility they have on their license, their career, right? Lawsuits, their insurance is probably going to go up too. And I would anticipate if this is based upon just a visual inspection, you're going to have all kind of caveats in that engineering report, just protect them, right? I mean, so you can look at it, there's so much judgment in this thing, so the inspector's got to say, oh my God, if the thing failed, now what? Or if he looks at it and it's fine, I've seen concrete before that looks fine, but a year later it starts to crumble. I mean, there's a lot of risk in this stuff.
Yeah, and risk means expense. And so I can tell you that the engineers are not going to do this for the cheap, okay? Because their butt's on the line if they're wrong. Also, it's a common expense of the association to pay for all this. So let's say you fail the phase 2, or the phase 2 says, yes, we have found structural problems. What if the repairs are required? The Board of County Commissioners may adopt an ordinance requiring you to schedule the repairs with a specified timeline. Repairs must be commenced no later than 365 days after receiving the report. That part of the law is directly related to Surfside, okay? And I'm not here to cast blame on anybody, but if you know the facts of that, these boards had in their possession engineering reports from years earlier identifying major problems, and they simply, for political reasons and the pressure of the homeowners not wanting to spend more money and all of those reasons, basically kick the can down the road. This law is no longer going to allow you to say, no, we don't want to do this, we're going to put it off. You got to do it within a year. You got to start within a year if you fail that phase 1, okay? If the association fails to submit proof of the local enforcement agency that repairs have been scheduled or commenced within the required time frame, the local agency must review and determine if the building is unsafe for human occupancy. So if you fail to do this, they could basically condemn the building and make you move out. So this is not anything that's going to be fun if you don't pass the first one. And let me also say this: another question I'm getting a lot of is a lot of proactive high-rise buildings after Surfside went out and got their own engineering study just recently, okay? Or if you're in Miami-Dade or Broward County, let's say you just had your 40-year, Miami-Dade and Broward County for years, due to a building collapse in the 70s, adopted a 40-year milestone inspection requirement, so that when your buildings in Miami-Dade were over 40 years old, you had to do a similar inspection. So the questions we're getting is, what if we're in Miami-Dade or Broward and we just did our 40-year inspection report required by their ordinances? Or what if we were proactive and we just had an engineering report done on our building just last year, just because we wanted to know if our building was good? I've had that question. The question is, well, do we have to do all this? And the answer is, yes, you're going to have to do this, but the engineer that did your earlier inspections may be able to use some of that data or recertify the report to meet this. But the milestone inspection is going to have state published forms that they're going to have to use. So I can't tell you, absolutely, you don't need to do anything more. You're going to need to go back to your engineer that just did these earlier reports for you and ask them, can you recertify this as the now required milestone inspection? And I'm just going to guess that you'll get some cost savings out of that, but I can't guarantee it. So once phase 1 and if necessary phase 2 are completed, the inspector who performed the inspection will submit a sealed copy of the inspection report to both the association and the local government for their review. Then the reports must bear the seal and signature of the licensed engineer or architect. They must indicate the type of inspection forming the basis for the inspection and identify any substantial structural deterioration, describe the extent of deterioration, and indemnify and recommend repairs for that deterioration. I think that word is probably identify, not indemnify, if it's right. The reports also must state whether unsafe or dangerous conditions exist or have been observed, recommend any remedial, preventive, or repair of the damaged areas, identify and describe any terms requiring further inspection. So it's going to be a very detailed report. Okay. Once the association receives the report, it must distribute the report to each owner, regardless of the findings or recommendations. Again, they can't just bury the report. They got to give it to all the owners. It must be delivered by US mail or personal delivery or electronic transmission. The summary provided by the inspector must be posted in a conspicuous place on the property. The full report must be posted on the association's website if they're required to have one. Condominiums with 150 more units have to have a particular website. If the association fails to complete this study, just doesn't do it, it is a breach of the board's fiduciary duty, and that can lead to personal liability of the board members. So this is no longer going to be just because it's going to cost a lot of money for your homeowners. You're just not going to do it. You're going to have no choice. Further, the new law authorizes the local enforcement agencies to adopt timelines and penalties for failing to comply. The Florida Building Commission will review the milestone inspection requirements imposed in the new law and make recommendations to the legislature to ensure the inspections are sufficient. So the report requirements may change. And the Florida Building Commission and Fire Marshal will work together to provide the legislature with recommendations for comprehensive structural and life safety standards for maintaining and inspecting buildings of 3 stories or higher. So that's a lot. Also,
Rich,
yeah.
here's a thought. You know, you think about the workflow. There's only a certain amount of engineering firms out there. This is going to exponentially increase their work volume, which means it's going to take them longer to get it done, right? Shortage of people, too much work. I'd start early. You got to do it. You know, don't be the last guy in there saying, hey, I need it next week. It won't happen. Start early and plan.
That's absolutely true. And remember, if your building is already 30 years old or older, or 25 years old or older, and 3 miles of the coast, you have to have this done by December 31, 2004. That's a little over 2.5 years away. Or yeah, 2.5 years away. Let's see, it's June 2022, 23, 24, yeah, about 2.5 years away. So don't wait. I mean, John is absolutely right. The engineers that can perform this is not every engineer in the state of Florida. It's a limited amount. And I assume the same with the architects. So I would get on board early and get this done and out of the way, because if you wait till the last 3 months, 90 days, it's like John and his team, when you go to them April 1st and say, I need some tax work done. I mean, they're inundated with tax filing deadline of April 15th. They're not going to be able to accommodate you. So don't wait, get on board with this stuff now. You might say, well, the legislature might change these dates. They might kick the can down the road, which sometimes happens with these types of, it happened with the fire life safety retrofit bills where they had dates and then they'd move the date 2 years out. That might happen, but I wouldn't bank on it. Okay. I would go ahead and get this done. And worst case scenario, they move the dates out to 2026, but you're already got it done. Okay. What John alluded to earlier, there are going to be changes in these laws over the next 2 legislative sessions. Undoubtedly, there will be changes, but the general consensus is those changes will be little tweaks to maybe dates and timeframes and financing options. They're not going to be as substantive revisions of not having to do this. So our recommendation is do not wait, get in line, get it done, and live
Hey,
with
Rich,
the
also,
consequences.
we should talk about this later in the presentation, but this is going to have a profound impact on every association in their budgeting process, right? You got to budget the cost of getting this done. It's going to have an impact on your insurance rates. We'll get into that later. And if there's this much more money coming in, everyone's going to be above 500,000. So everyone's going to have to get audits. You better budget that in, right?
There's a lot of trickle down effects that we're not even fully aware of. Well, John and I have just been speculating, wow, this is going to affect all these other things. And then when we get into the reserve study, we've got some really good comments on that. But so finally, for community association managers, there is a part of the bill that says the community association manager or firm that has a building on the property that's subject to this must comply with that as directed by the board. I'm not really sure what that means, except the board if the board tells the manager to go out and do this, you got to do it. I mean, but that seems kind of odd to me that the manager works for the board anyway, but in any case. Okay. So that's part one, the milestone inspections. Okay. There's also another part of the bill that I didn't address in there. By January 1 of 2023, which is basically at the end of this year, by 12/31/2022, any condo or co-op that has a building that's 3 stories or more in height is going to have to submit to the Division of Condominiums and Cooperatives on a form that they've yet to publish, but they will be publishing this form. You will have to submit to them identifying the address and location of all buildings that are in the condominium or co-op that are 3 stories more in height. You must identify the number of units. You must identify the addresses of those units and certain other information. Essentially, what the division is doing is they're trying to compile a database of all the condo and co-op buildings in the state of Florida that these milestone inspections and reserve studies will apply to. So they will then know who is subject to this law, and that's why they can track back to you if you haven't done it or complied. So that's another thing you might want to start doing. The form hasn't been published yet, but I imagine it will be published shortly on the division website, and you must complete the form and send it in by December 31, 2022. The question I've had is, well, what if we have a bunch of 2-story buildings and one high-rise 3-story, 4-story building? Well, you're going to have to fill out the form for the 3-story building. You're going to have to do the milestone inspection for the 3-story building, but you're not going to have to do it for the others. I know a question that I'm going to get. What if one of the condo buildings, it's one condominium or one co-op, but there are 3 buildings. 2 buildings are 2 stories, 1 building is 3 stories. So only the 3-story building has to follow the milestone inspection. The question I can anticipate is, well, who do the owners that live in the 2-story buildings have to pay for the building that they don't even are part of? If it's a single condominium and not a multi-condominium, the answer is going to be yes. This is going to be a common expense. If you're a multi-condominium, which means more than one distinct condominium operated by a single association, in that scenario, I would suspect that the high-rise 3-story or more building would be the only one that would have to pay for it, because you have to have a separate budget in a multi-condominium. So I'm just speculating on that question arising. Okay, the next big section here that was, this is part 2. This is the structural integrity reserve study. And this is probably going to have a long-standing impact on your condominiums and co-ops that are 3 stories or more. And John will explain in a minute, significant impact on your budgeting. Okay. But here's what the law does. It creates right now, condominiums and co-ops, no matter the size, are required to have reserves for painting, paving, and roofing, and any capital item like an elevator or a swimming pool that costs $10,000 or more to replace. Was the current law. Okay. The law also said, up until this new law, that any condo or co-op could waive those reserves on a majority vote of the owners voting and say, we don't want the roof reserve, or they could vote on an annual basis to say, we're only going to fund 50% of the roof reserve. Or they also had the alternative to say, you know what, we're going to take money out of that roof reserve and use it for something else other than the roof. That was all legal, commonly done, was all available for owners to vote to do every year if they wanted to do it. So we're sitting here today with co-ops and condos that probably have no reserves or woefully underfunded reserves. What we're going to go into next here, what they've done is they've still kept those 3 reserves, painting, paving, roofing, $10,000 or more capital item. But now they've added to those reserves. And those are special structural integrity reserves, which are reserves that are related to items that affect the structural integrity of the building. Now, what they've done with those reserves, if the reserve is part of, and we're going to go down the list in a minute, if the reserve is now part of the special structural integrity reserve, guess what? it cannot be waived at all. It cannot be used for any other purpose ever, even with a vote of the owners. And you must fully fund it every year. So those are going to be non-waivable, non-reserves that are subject to, you can't do anything with them except collect them and use them for the purpose intended, and you must do it. That's
So
where
Richard,
John's going to tell you about
so what
significant
does,
financial issues.
yeah, so what does that mean for the structural integrity reserves? The pooled method is gone. I mean, you can have other reserves, a second reserve list, if you will, where you can have pooled stuff. But as it relates to these items, it has to be straight line. Like you got roof, floor, foundation, those dollars have to be collected and used for that specific purpose. So by definition, you're back to the straight line method.
Yeah, so you
Right.
won't be able to pool the structural integrity reserves, but you could still pool the non-structural integrity reserves. And we're going to get into that in a minute. So here is another date and deadline that you have to deal with. Now, remember, although it's a little ambiguous in the law, we believe this only applies to 3 stories or more higher condos or co-ops. Okay. There is a part of this that people think maybe it applies to all of them, but that's not what was intended. And I'm sure that will be clarified in the future. But a study of the reserves funds required for future major repairs and replacement of the common areas based on visual inspection performed. Again, this is a reserve study that's going to have to be now performed not by a reserve specialist company, and there are several of them. It has to be, again, performed by a licensed architect or engineer. Now, your reserve study company might have a licensed architect or engineer, but I can tell you many of them don't. And this was very controversial because there are a lot of very reputable reserve study companies in the state of Florida that do a very good job, but they don't have structural engineers or architects on their staff, and they're cut out of doing this special reserve study. And that's taking business away from them. And they were very upset with that. Will that change in the future? I don't know. But for now, you're going to have an initial structural integrity reserve study completed again by December 31, 2024. And then that will have to be redone every 10 years. Okay. The structural integrity reserve study must identify common areas being inspected, the remaining useful life, the estimated replacement costs or deferred maintenance expense, provide a recommended annual reserve amount. So that study is going to have to tell you how much you're going to have to reserve. And the law also says when they recommend the amount, you must fund that amount. You're not going to be able to say, well, you know, he said the roof's going to cost $100,000. We don't think it's going to be $100,000. We're only going to put 90 in. You're not going to have the discretion to choose a different amount when the structural integrity reserve study engineer or architect says, this is the dollars you need. Those are the dollars you got to fund. So you're going to lose that discretion. Now, what items are now required in this special structural integrity reserve study? They're right here. The roof. Okay, the roof is now not a waivable reserve. It's now a structural integrity reserve. Load-bearing walls or primary structural members. The floor, the foundation, the fireproofing and fire protection systems, the plumbing, the electrical systems, the waterproofing and exterior painting. So painting is now out of the discretionary reserve line item and is in the structural integrity mandatory reserve. The windows. The question with the windows is, what if your condo or co-op documents make the owners responsible for the windows, which is very common? Why would we have to reserve for those when we're not responsible for them? Because the law now says you do. Okay. Now here's the catch-all. Look at this catch-all. This catch-all at the end here is any other item that has a deferred maintenance expense or replacement that exceeds $10,000 and the failure to place or maintain such item negatively affects any of the items listed above. Now, the example that an engineer gave me was a seawall. A seawall, he said, will be an item that if it fails will negatively impact the foundation and the building, possibly. Now, it could be a seawall that's a quarter mile away, or if it's a condo that has the seawall that's 30 yards away, maybe there's a distinction. But that catch-all, the thing that John and I noticed, and it didn't take a genius, even though John's a genius, when you look at this, this is effectively reserving to replace the entire building, which I think is is going to bankrupt some people. I mean, you don't plan to replace the entire building, because your typical thought is, if I have to replace the entire building, that's because the entire building failed due to a fire, a hurricane, or some other natural disaster. In this case, you look at these components, you're essentially going to have to reserve enough money to replace the entire building. John, what are your thoughts on that?
That's the biggest concern here. Economics, it rules the planet. It affects how we think, how you operate, how much money do you have? You think about what's going to happen. You're going to have certain condos that are on the water, 3 stories or higher, and the residents are going to go, we can't come up with $40 million to make this stuff happen, right? So is it going to force terminations? Are they going to have to terminate the condominium, sell it to a developer or someone else to come in because economically they can't implement this? The choices aren't good, or if you have something that's inland where, you're landlocked and you're greater than 3 stories, and it's going to take you 15 million to replace it. Those folks aren't going to be able to afford it. They're screwed. Is the developer going to come in and buy that? Probably not. So there's a whole lot of what ifs. And you read this, great concept, but how in the heck is this going to get implemented? It's scary. I could see terminations. I could see, I'm pretty sure you got FLAW and the home builders associations and everybody else pounding on the legislators going, come on, man, how are we going to do this? So there's a lot of what ifs, a lot of concerns. I can see it driving the price of condos down, because who's going to afford to live in it? Down the road, the ones that survive and say they're on the water, where you got billionaires buying, I could see if you got $15 million of reserve funds, it's going to be very expensive to even buy into that, because now you got to buy the condo. Now you got to buy into part of the reserves, the 15 million. There's a whole lot of crazy questions. And how is it going to affect the insurance for every condo? I could see them going to some co-insurance, down the road, so if it's going to take 40 million to replace the building, and let's say you got, 20 million in reserves, maybe the association's responsible for first 20 million, and then there's a reinsurance above that, perhaps, so there's a lot of unanswered questions here, but, I guess the answer is stay tuned.
Right. Okay, so more on this. An association that currently exists on or before July 1, 2022, that is controlled by unit owners, must have this first structural integrity reserve study done by, again, that magic date of December 31, 2024. Again, an engineer and or architect have to do it. I wouldn't wait, because they're going to be inundated with doing milestone studies, and now they got to do a reserve study, and those are different studies. So you should get on board with this sooner.
Hey, Rich, there's a great question that just popped up. Is this thing going to be prospective going forward, or there's going to have to be some retroactive application?
It applies to everybody. That's this part is not based on 25-year or 30-year timeline. Okay. This part on structural integrity reserve studies applies to everybody right now that is 3 stories or more in height. Okay.
So is it going to affect the budget year for 23?
Not if they don't funding. It's got to be done by December 31, 2024. So it's going to definitely affect the 2024 budget.
Okay.
Okay. If you start earlier, you're going to have to budget for it.
Right. But when you fund in 24, the assessments have to go up, and it moves forward. It's prospective. You don't have to
start funding these until the 2025 budget. Basically, your 2025 budget year will have to contain these dollar amounts indicated in the structural integrity reserve study. So you've got some time to plan.
And I'd also say get real close to your insurance company, because they don't even know what's going to happen with rates, or I can anticipate them not even knowing how to insure this yet.
And I can anticipate that people that see this coming, if I was in a situation that was in a tightly run condo or co-op, and I wasn't a billionaire or a millionaire, and I see what's coming in 2025, and the condo market is still pretty hot right now, and the average buyer isn't going to understand any of this, folks. It might be time to sell. Okay, get out while the getting's good. I'm not advising you of that. I think if you're on a strict income type budget and this is going to affect your community, you may want to consider that. Now, the whole community may, as John mentioned, may decide as they get into this, you know, we're not the type of condo that can afford all this, and a developer is giving us a sweetheart deal to walk away. Maybe you collectively do that. But I'm just telling you, if you're a condo that is not fully funded with reserves now, you're not in a super high income bracket, and you're on a tight budget, these are considerations that you folks are going to have to start thinking about, because this train is left the station and it's coming. Okay.
Yeah, and Rich, I guess the message is the board's got to get together, pull your council in, pull your CPAs in, study this thing, start looking at your options now. You know, I mean, life just got more expensive here because it's just not, you know, hey, I got to fund a whole, you know, my assessments are going to go up sixfold or whatever it is. That's one issue. The reserve studies, because of the risk, those are going to go up. Who knows what's going to happen with insurance? And if an association is collecting this amount of money, everybody will be over $500,000, which means now you want to get an audit, because, you know, theft, you know, we do this stuff. Theft is rampant. The more money there is in the reserve fund, the better you better start watching it closely. You know,
okay.
So there's a lot to think about here.
Yeah. So if an association fails to complete this reserve study, it's a breach of the fiduciary duty, again, putting the board members at personal risk. So keep that in mind. The division has jurisdiction to handle complaints against an association that fails to meet or do these studies, so you could get penalized for it. Official records, these studies become official records. The structural integrity reserve study and the milestone inspection report are now going to be official records that must be kept. The milestone study must be kept for 15 years, and the structural integrity reserve study must be kept for 15 years after it's done. So those are new official records requirements. Renters will be entitled to copies of these reports. Renters right now have a right to the declaration, bylaws, and rules. They'll now be able to say, I want to see the reserve study and the milestone study. They're entitled to that even as a renter. If the condo is 150 or more units, they got to put it on their website. We've talked about that. In monetary and budgetary matters. So now the proposed annual budget must include the most recent structural integrity reserve study as prepared by the inspector. We talked about that. That will be effective December 31, 2024. The members may not waive or provide the funding or reduce reserves that are required. That's what we talked about. These special reserves are non-waivable, must be fully funded, cannot be pooled, can't be used for another purpose. Okay. Here's another part that's going to affect, if you are currently in a condominium that is still under developer control and it's 3 stories or more in height, the developer is now going to have to provide, before turnover, the developer must have a structural integrity reserve study completed for each building that's 3 stories or more. So that's going to be a new turnover requirement. That's effective right now. Okay. Developers must also perform a milestone report in compliance with 553. So that milestone report, in my understanding, is even though the building's not 30 or 25 years old, they're going to require you to give a milestone report. This will be helpful to turnover groups that typically go and hire their own engineer, because the developers currently didn't have any obligation to tell you that there were defects in the building. This report that they're now going to have to pay for is going to be very helpful and maybe reduce your turnover costs, because you maybe won't have to hire or an engineer that does as much. I don't know. I'm just speculating.
Yeah, but Rich, that makes sense though, because you got a third party, a structural engineer that's going to check on the developer's work and quality. So it may reduce 558 claims, might give the homeowners peace of mind. You know, that's the byproduct.
Yeah. We already talked about this, but this is that by the end of this year, you're going to have to give the division the number of buildings that are 3 stories or more, the total number of units, the addresses, and the counties where they're located. They're going to make that index, so they're going to know who you are. This just says that they're going to provide all this information to anybody that wants it. This is the last part that I talked about. We're at the end of the slides. This is the part that applies to all condos and co-ops and single family homes. This is just a change in the law regarding when you have to replace a roof and when you have to comply with the current code. The new law says if 25% or more of the roofing system or roofing section is being repaired or replaced, okay, you're not replacing the whole roof, you're only replacing part of the roof, you only have to bring up to current code that portion of the roof that you're repairing or replacing, not the whole roof. The old law, which is here in number 2, basically said, if you're repairing or replacing more than 25% of your roof, you have to bring the entire roof up to code, even if the rest of the roof is perfectly fine. They've now flipped that. So now you no longer have to bring the whole roof up to code. You only have to bring the roof portion that is being repaired up to code. Something you want to talk about with your roofer. This applies to everybody. Let's see if there was, okay, we're not going to go into these other slides because they're really more about other legal update issues not related to the Surfside thing, which we're going to cover in another seminar because we have about 10 minutes or 12 minutes left. So Rain, why don't we start fielding some questions?
Hey, Rich, let me just to clarify. I think this would also apply to a commercial condo, still 718.
That's a great question. I believe you're correct. There's no distinction that I saw in the new law about residential condo only. So a commercial condo potentially has to do all these studies as well.
Right. Now, here's another thought. So let's say a condo says, hey, I can't afford the reserves, so they terminate. Can they, if they terminate it, can they turn it into like an apartment complex? Or if they terminate it, can they just self-exist and not have to worry about 718?
Well, I know they can terminate it and turn it into an apartment complex. And I could see clever attorneys saying, okay, all the current owners, we're going to make a new company called Apartment Building LLC. We're going to terminate the condo. We're going to put the condo building into the LLC. It's kind of like a co-op, and the LLC will rent you the apartment. But if they stay out of 719, the Co-op Act, maybe they get out of all this. I don't know. There are going to be some very clever schemes, legal, I don't know, but I can see people already trying to figure out a way. But you can obviously terminate a condo or a co-op and turn it into an apartment building. That's done all the time. The owners are typically bought out, and a single developer entity owns it and rents to whoever he wants. So if that occurred, maybe the developer rents you back your apartment for an agreed upon years, and he bought you out to get you to terminate. There's going to be money to be made, particularly in this market, hopefully with the high prices. But
so I got to, so let me clarify something here. I want people to understand that you can have there's pre-existing reserves that are out. This is a whole nother section of reserves that deal with these 9 items plus the catch-all, right? So let's just focus on the structural part, the new requirements that are out. You can't pool this thing doesn't say you can't, but by definition, you have to collect money for each of these 9 components, and those dollars have to be used for those 9 components. So that in itself just defines the straight line method. That's the purpose of the straight line method. You collect funds for your roof. It can only be used for the roof. You can't pool it, right? So that wipes out the pooled method. But now if you have pre-existing reserves that doesn't qualify for the structural stuff, do what you want to do. Those laws are still in place. You can waive those, but you can't waive the new stuff.
Yeah, so essentially you can waive the parking lot reserve, you could waive the swimming pool reserve, the tennis court reserve. I don't know if you could waive an elevator reserve, if that's a component that is structurally impacts the rest. I have no idea, but potentially you could.
Well, there's 2 things in here that give me some heartburn. Floor. The hell's a floor? Is that your parking lot? Foundation. What's your, is it elevator part of your foundation? I mean, there's so much subjectivity to this. I'd hate to be an engineer, but if I'm an engineer, I'm going to go on the side of being very cautious because I don't want to get sued. my insurance rates and all that. There's a lot of economics that come into play here. So
Absolutely.
good luck to those guys, but I hope there's some good glitch bills that come out for clarification.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be. So Rain, we have some questions.
Yep, we have a whole slew of just about 30 questions. So some of them are going to be quick rapid fire, and I'm going to go in order of oldest to newest. So the first question is, I live in a 53-year-old co-op. When will we be informed that a milestone inspection is required?
I just informed you, it'll be required by December 31, 2024. Now, technically, you're supposed to get a notice from the county or whatever, but that's the date. You've been informed.
Perfect. Our condo association has structural and electrical inspection done by engineers after Surfside. We are a Gulf front 17-story and built in 1981. Does that suffice for the new legislation?
We talked about that. No, technically, no, it does not, because it's not on the forms and the things that they're going to require. But will the substance of it cover most of what's required? I would suspect the answer is going to be yes, but you're going to still have to go back to the engineer and have him recertify it as meeting the milestone inspection requirement. That may be as simple as changing the name and putting his name on it if it meets all the criteria, or they may say, well, I got to do a few more things that I didn't do. Okay, so it depends. It will be helpful, but I can't tell you that you don't have to do anything else.
Okay, here's a question. Talking about the waiving of reserves. This is very interested to know if the no waiving of reserves or partial funding of reserves is still allowed for associations that are under 3 stories.
Yeah, none of that we talked about applies to you guys. You can waive, you don't have to collect those special reserves. You still only have to collect painting, paving, roofing, capital item, $10,000 or more. You can waive it, you can partially fund it, you can vote to use it for another purpose.
Okay. How many years must a reserve study go out in the future?
The longest life.
Well, yeah. You're going to have to do the structural integrity reserve study every 10 years. You're going to have to do you're going to have to fund the reserves under the normal method. You still got to fund them every year. But yeah, the person that does the study will tell you the life of the foundation is 50 years. The life of the seawall is 40 years, whatever they determine.
Okay, this one, it might just be a little bit of clarification on the wording. The question is, does the structural integrity reserve study imply you need a reserve study of your reserves, or the reserve schedule is a different report?
Now, the structural integrity reserve study is absolutely a reserve study you must have by an architect or an engineer. The non-structural integrity reserve study, there is no requirement to have a reserve company or an engineer do it. You can go get a general contractor and say, how long do you think the parking lot's going to last, or a paving company, and they can do it that way. But you always have had to base reserves on some objective data. You're not allowed to just make it up. You got to say, well, a roofer told me the roof is good for 20 more years and it's going to cost 100 grand. So,
hey, Rich, let me jump in here, because the AICPA in our technical codifications actually has some guidance here. And it says it's section 972 of the AICPA codification, which is our technical junk. It says reserve studies are not required. It's a tool, but management can also get estimates or bids to figure that out. Now that's changed because of this. You don't have to get reserve studies if it's less than the 3 floors, meaning it doesn't qualify. But now, because of this new law, you have to get a reserve study. So the AICPA is going to have to adapt their thinking here. So it's the law.
Okay.
Hey, next question is, how does this law affect the 2023 reserves?
It doesn't.
So they can follow the same way that they've had it.
Yeah, it's my understanding of the dates, you're going to have to include these dollars in your 2025 budget.
Okay. Here's a question. Do you think engineers that find buildings with substantial damage that need immediate repair will recommend condemning the building until work is done to protect themselves?
It's up to them. It's their discretion.
Yeah.
Another question that came in, it says, is there an approximate cost for the inspection? And I'm thinking they're talking about the milestone.
Yeah, it's up to the engineer.
Yeah. You call your insurance agent.
Next question. How do the requirements for structural reserves affect an association's reserves accounting process?
That's a John question.
Yeah, Rain, say that again.
How do the requirements for a structural reserve study affect an association's reserves accounting process?
Yeah, okay, so you're gonna have, once you get the engineering report, you're gonna have to have a whole nother reserve section. If you're gonna have to list out the 9 items as a component, have its estimated useful replacement cost divided by its useful life, and that's your annual funding requirement. Now, it could get tricky if, say, someone has roof painting and pavement already established. Well, you're gonna have to take the roof component and throw it over into the structural component. So associations could now have 2 different reserves, one for the structural component, one is for what they've already had.
All right, so there's several questions that have come up talking about the coastline. I've seen various different ones. Do you have any further insight on that, Richard, of exactly what's defined as coastline? Is it Gulf? Is it the Atlantic? Is it rivers, flood zones?
I knew that question would come up and I didn't prepare an answer for it. I don't know if the statute covers it. Obviously, if you're on the beach, you're on the coastline. The question is, if you're upriver, so I don't know the answer to that, but we will find out the answer. Now, one of the interesting points that came up in another discussion was, is, let's say the condominium boundary is within the boundary, which may be a preserve area, is within 3 miles of the coast, but the actual building is 3¼ miles. Does this apply? I haven't gone into the law enough to know. So that it literally could come down to inches in some of these cases about whether you're 3 miles or closer or not. But all that does is give you a shorter time frame. All that, it doesn't change anything except if you're closer, you got to do it more often, 25 years versus 30.
Perfect. This one is just a little bit clarification. The question was asked, is the reserve study a function of failing the phase 1 study? And I think
No.
they might be getting the milestone and the structural integrity mixed up.
No, they are. The milestone study, phase 1 and phase 2, is completely separate and distinct from the structural integrity reserve study, even though they kind of look at the same things.
Okay. What if one of these items of $10,000 or more is past their lifespan at the time that we start the reserves?
It would need to be fully funded that immediately, and you'd have to replace it.
Another question. So if the price for all of these items, and I believe that they're referring to the structural integrity, is in the millions, will we need to put the total cost of that into our 2024 budget?
I think so.
Well, yeah,
well,
I mean, when it kicks in, you have to have the total replacement cost of these 9 items. The total, whatever comes off this engineering report as the total replacement cost, that's going to be your numerator. Your denominator is your remaining useful life.
Right. And another thing that it said in those reports, that those reports are actually going to tell you how much you need to fund. And
Right.
That's the amount that you're going to have to put in. So I believe in it starting in 2025, they're going to tell you how much you have to contribute. 2024 and even 2023 could possibly use as preparation periods where you start building those and getting them ready so they're not as high. Next question. Are we to understand that the structural integrity reserve study that dictates what money is needed needs to be 100% fully funded in 2025? Or is it planned out over time to reach 100% funded?
Oh, it's planned out over time like a normal reserve, unless, from the question earlier, if the reserve study says this thing's at the end of its useful life, then it will have to be fully funded. But assuming they're going to tell you the foundation is still good for 30 more years, then you fund that part of the reserve over 30 years.
Okay, the next question is, just to clarify, condos with 3 stories or more must have a structural visual study done by the end of 2024, irregardless of if it's 30 years or more. I think they may have that confused,
No.
Richard.
No, only if you're 30 years or more old now or will be by that date, you have to have it. You might be a 20-year-old condo right now So that would mean by 2032, you're going to have it. Okay.
Okay. I'm trying to weed through some of them because a lot of people are asking about today's presentation. We will be releasing a copy of this afterwards. We'll be releasing that out to everybody. So you'll be getting that in your emails for all of those that participated, a copy of the PowerPoint. Next question I have here is, based on conversations with engineer firms, recommend starting reserves established at $10,000 a year for the study. So that's a good estimate that somebody is actually throwing out there for about how much these may cost. Next question. Are there enough engineers in Florida to execute this? As you say, the fees will be totally up to the engineering firm, no formula or fee calculations.
Yeah, but Rain, that's what I said earlier. If you have to have this thing done, start to plan for it, because there's going to be such a huge backlog in work that these engineers have to get done. Who knows how long it's going to take them to get each one done. They'll be working extra hours, but there's going to be so much work. Don't wait till the last minute. You got to do it. Start to plan for it.
Oops, a couple questions just popped off. When pooled reserves are converted for the strategic reserves, will each item be prorated? And then will there be a membership vote required? I think that question is really saying, if we've pooled our funds before and we've had them for roof as well as for painting, and now we're trying to comply with what the new law now says, how do they determine how to allocate it? Is it prorating? Is it a membership vote? Any input, John or Richard?
Well, okay. Hey, Rich, here's my thoughts. I mean, you have all your components and you're collecting an amount. What I would recommend from an accounting economic perspective is you can do calculations to prorate your pool based upon the calculations, your estimated replacement cost. It's a simple mathematical calculation. You document it, and that's this share that you have to shift over and put it into the structural reserves.
Yeah,
so it's easy to do. You know,
you should know in your pooled reserves today how much of that was allocated to the roof, and then you would move that.
Yeah, but Rich, you won't know, because what will happen if, you know, I've got these components and my estimated replacement cost. The thing about the pooled method, it's cash flow. As long as you don't go below zero, the board might go, hey, this year we're going to do 10 grand. Next year we might do 100 grand. So you're going to have to go through this allocation process, and that was a good question. We can give you advice and help you, but you got to go through that allocation process to determine that pro rata share per roof that gets pulled out.
Yeah, but I don't think an owner vote would be required. Just segregate the proper amount out of the pool for the roof and any other structural component and move it to its separate reserve. I don't think an owner vote would be required.
I would agree, because this is now law. There's no
you got to do
here.
it.
Got to.
Okay. Questions are, does any of this, and it's just for clarification, does any of this clarify to 2-story or to 1-story condominiums?
There's no applicability if you're under 3 stories.
Perfect. This one came in. How can we be protected from bad estimates of structural items? We just went through a roofing company's estimates of 4.5 million for the reserves, but actuals a year later came in less than 2.5.
It's going to be the engineer's insurance policy.
Yeah, I think you're going to find that in engineers and architects, and this is nothing against roofers, but there's a lot more roofers out there that are in a scale of really good roofers and really shyster roofers. So you're not going to be just hiring Uncle Joe's roofer buddy to do this study. You're going to be hiring a exceedingly qualified, credentialed engineer, and I don't suspect you're going to get a lot of bad apples. I'm not saying you won't, but use the people that are in the industry that do this stuff. Don't, Johnny come lately, maybe isn't the guy to use.
No, yeah, make sure they're well established. But like I said earlier, every engineering firm is going to look at this and go, man, our risk went up. This is a serious thing. They're going to take longer. They're going to study it harder. They're going to make sure they don't overlook something. This is some serious stuff. And so there's more risk and more liability on insurance companies to perform this.
Right. This one is saying, are you saying that for a new building of say 20 stories, the entire construction cost must be included in the report?
Effectively, if you look at that list of structural reserve, mandatory reserves, It's walls, floors, roof, foundation, and all structural members. I mean, that's the building. You know, it's not drywall, it's not carpeting, it's not cabinetries, but when the building was built and all of that stuff hadn't been put in, and it includes windows. So what you're really looking at is the building built before the developer finished out the interiors. That's what it looks like to me.
Okay. Here's another question that came in, and it just came in, so I think some people are needing clarification. It says our condo complex is now 17 years old and uses the pooled method. So do we now have to go to the straight line? We voted in the past not to fully fund reserves. Can we still do this, or do we have to go to the straight line?
No, the answer to that is they can keep their current method. They're going to have to extract any of these 9 elements and move them over into the structural integrity reserves, and that has to be on a straight line method.
And that has to be done by 2025.
Yeah, but if they currently have reserves on the pool method, you can leave them and do what you always do. But if there's a component like roof that belongs in the other reserves for the structure, that has to be prorated, calculated, extracted, and put into this new reserve, fund.
Okay. And I'm not too sure, this was right at the tail end when we started talking about some stuff about homeowners associations and reserves. And the question was, why are HOAs exempt from this ruling, or did I not hear this correctly? So
because single family homes, although you could have villa homes, you could have villa homes that are 3 stories or more in height, but which could be an HOA, but because the only statutes that were changed were 718 for condos and 719 for co-ops. It's theoretically, you could have an HOA building that is more than 3 stories in height, but that just wasn't included.
okay. Yeah. There was a question that popped up of who is the responsibility of the windows. Richard, I think you said earlier that depends on what your documents say. Is that correct?
Yes. Depend on the
Okay.
document. A thought, John, from that last question. I could see developers now, we're all familiar with like walk-up style brownstone HOA buildings, okay? It's a single building and you own a slice of the building, kind of like a brownstone, okay? But they're connected. I have a lot of communities like that. They're usually 2 stories in height, but they're HOAs, okay? They look like a condo, they feel like a condo because they're attached, but they're under 720. I could see, I don't know that you could make multi-level apartments that way, but you could certainly, I don't know. I'm just, things are popping in my mind.
But here's something to think about. I mean, let's say you've got 4 individual condominiums and there's a master. That means this master, even though it's drafted as an HO, becomes a condominium because they're surrounded by condos. So now you got to look at that condo, and that's going to fit into the same requirements. The master association, so if they have a clubhouse or something that's 3 floors, I think this comes into play.
It certainly could.
And I'm not too sure where they're going with this one. It says, do structural and non-structural elements have to be considered as separate reports?
It could be in the same report, but they're going to have to say part 1 is non-structural, part 2 is structural. They want to delineate for you that. But let me back up. The non-structural stuff could still be done by a reserve specialist that's not an engineer. So that may be more cost effective. Or you could just go out and get an estimate from a parking lot paving company, so that you may have some cost savings by not having an engineer do those non-structural components.
Okay. We're getting tons and tons of people just throwing in their comments. So I apologize. It's hard to decipher just comments through actual questions. But here I have another question. It says, so as it reads now, if the structure total is $60 million with a 30-year estimated remaining life, you'd have to fund $2 million a year cumulatively. Is that correct?
Yeah, that sounds like the math, but this is why people are going to be talking termination.
Yeah.
There's a lot to think about here.
Yep. Comment here. Do you foresee that this bill causing management companies additional liability?
No, unless they do something that they shouldn't be doing, but they're going to have to work with the boards to make sure the boards are in compliance with this stuff, you know? But this is what I mean. The board needs to have a good management company, good law firm, good CPA firm, good insurance guy, and that's their team that helps keep them safe. But if something goes wrong, it's coming back to the board. They are managed.
There's a question that's in here. It says, what happens with new associations that have not turned over? Maybe is this the type of thing that they have a little bit of a time period to where they can actually turn over and then not have to comply with these new laws?
No, that's the part. If they're 3 stories or more in height, the developer is going to have to provide you these 2 reports on his dime. So that is helpful.
But Richard, let me interject something. You go back to the developer world. If this comes into play and a developer is still building out a condo greater than 3 floors, that developer has to make sure these reserves, the structural reserves, are in there. You know what's going to happen? It's going to be really tough for these guys to sell condos because, you know, their assessments are going to go way up because they're going to have to rebuild the dang, you know, right?
Yeah,
they can rebuild.
That's a good point. The part we didn't really cover. Right now, a developer of a condominium can waive all the reserves on his or her own vote only for the first 2 full fiscal years of operation.
Yeah, but the developer can't vote.
No, when in the first 2 full fiscal years, he can do it on his own. After that, he has to get a vote of the non-developer unit owners. What this law says, though, is he's not going to be able to waive those even on his own vote during those full 2 fiscal years. So that means you will have to have fully funded reserves based on the schedule from year 1 of operation. That's going to make the price of condos go up.
Yeah. So you know what's going to happen after these are done? Any condos coming out from developers are going to be two floors, and the rest is HOA.
Yeah.
You know, I love the developer world because they say to the politicians, "You write the rules, we'll work around them." And that's, like I say, it's all about economics. If they can't sell it, they're going to do something different.
Right.
Yeah. I'm trying to scan through because we probably easily have gotten 100 of different comments and questions and stuff that's come in, and I'm trying to read through it. A lot of people are questioning some of the different things that we've said and we've gone through, like how do we deal with all this stuff with the windows if it's not our responsibility? And like Richard and John said in the beginning, you know, we're trying to relay this information to you. We don't know all the answers. There may be future changes to the laws, but we just have to take the things on the surface of exactly what they say. We can give you our opinion of where we think some of this is ultimately going to go, but some of this we do not have some of the answers for. So the questions
Richard,
about
Richard, you may have to rewrite some of the documents.
Yeah, I mean, again, we've had this bill in our lap for approximately 2 weeks. So we're giving you the best that a 2-week review can give you. I imagine we will have several more Surfside bill related webinars when we get the answers to these questions. And certainly when the legislature is going to address all of these questions you guys are great questions. They're all questions that we're going to start debating in the condo world and in the legislature, and there will be fixes or changes. But for now, this is what it is. And I didn't want to put our web information up there because we've got your email addresses. We will email everyone either a link to this PowerPoint or send it to you directly. So you don't need to email us and ask for it. We're going to do that. You can expect to see that in a day or 2.
Hey, so Rich, here's another thought. We've got 100+ type questions. I think when we get done, let's go through these questions because I think we need to do a follow-up workshop for this to gear it towards all these questions that are being asked. They'll give us a chance to go look at the law, look at some of these issues, and then we'll track it. And as we get more information, I can see us doing several of these to keep people updated, but to answer all these questions. There's 100+ questions. We got to follow up and get them answered.
Right. Good idea. Okay.
All right. Well, I think with that, I think it's just a great opportunity just to kind of end it here because we're getting here to about 11:15, and I know people have plans and other meetings that they have scheduled. But we thank you everyone here for joining us. Richard and John, I thank you both so much for taking this opportunity to help educate all of us and answer our questions. And then unless you have any last words here, I think we're getting ready to sign off.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.
Yep. Buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride.